Hello, Pier Luigi. This is Pier Luigi Sacco, who I'm talking with, and he's one of the main experts in the world who's thought through what culture is about, its role, its potential, but also the flip sides of all of that, as well as describing, from my point of view, so well the dynamics of the creative economy, its delights and dilemmas, and so on. Now, Pier Luigi, you use a phrase which I think is really interesting, which is moving from culture 1.0 to culture 3.0. Could you do a sort of short presentation on the essence of that and why it's so important to really consider and think through the implications of culture 3.0?
Thank you, Charles. This is a very important question from my side because I think that many of the misunderstandings of the current policy debates are linked to the fact that people consider and sometimes confound several different regimes of cultural production at once. The point is that these regimes of cultural production clearly have a different historical origin, but today coexist. So it's not probably fair to say that there is a transition from culture 1.0 to culture 3.0, but rather a growing coexistence of different cultural regimes, where clearly the most recent, like culture 3.0, are of course particularly relevant for the times we are in. Shortly put, the three regimes correspond to what we could synthetically call the patronage regime, which is the more historically ingrained, which is culture 1.0, the culture and creative industries regime that has clearly dominated the 20th century, which is our culture 2.0 regime, and what we could call the open platforms regime, that we call culture 3.0, and which is today the really emerging regime with characteristics we are just starting to understand. So most of what we have learned about cultural policy in Europe is linked to the tradition of the patronage regime, so the oldest of all regimes, and a regime in which basically culture is about elevating people to the condition that has been defined and sanctioned by the cultural experts, the gatekeepers. So the idea is to access culture as gatekeepers do as a model, with implicit assumption that by so doing, people will improve not only their cultural appreciation, but they would probably also enhance so many aspects of their own understanding of reality, human relationships, and so on. The culture and creative industry regime starts from very different premises. And these premises are that clearly there is a demand for mass culture, which is mostly linked to entertainment, although not necessarily shallow entertainment, can also be an entertainment that has a very important meiotic balance, for example, but entertainment anyway. And so the idea is that the standard in this case is defined by, as everywhere else in markets, by the taste of the customers, and consequently that the role of gatekeepers is rather limited, and that of course for profit maximizing companies that are willing to provide culture and creative content, there are spaces of course to structure markets and to build business models and so on and so forth. What we are observing with culture 3.0 is a very different phenomenon. And this phenomenon in particular is linked to what we could call the end of the so-called scarcity economy. a situation in which for people it becomes increasingly important to define their own social identity also through cultural expression, which is something that becomes particularly urgent in societies in which it's not simply access to physical resources that define your social identity. And this means that there is today an increasing demand for people to participate actively in the creation of cultural narratives and cultural expressions. So, what characterized this regime with respect to the previous ones is the breaking down of the barrier between producers of content and users and the audiences. So, everybody today, in principle, has the ambition to participate in these processes of creation of cultural and creative content. But of course, this is more easily said than done. And despite the fact that we have, of course, an increasingly enabling technology, let's think, for example, of the digital production of cultural and creative content that basically puts at the fingertips of everyone the possibility of using state-of-the-art production tools in practically every field of creative activity. This does not mean that everybody is equally able to participate actively in this process. And the preliminary evidence that we have is that still, despite this huge amount of possibility, most of the social and cultural trends are made by a relatively small number of very creative and specialized people that not necessarily have the same standing of the experts or the professionals in the patronage regime, but nevertheless still maintain a huge social influence and opinion leadership in doing this. The perspective for the future is to think of Culture 3.0 as a very, very powerful platform for processes of collective intelligence and co-creation. This is really what we could aim for realistically in the next couple of decades. But the main point today, the most critical one, is that the actual platforms, the digital platforms that intermediate most of this kind of production and interaction, are managed by companies that, although technologically very sophisticated, in terms of business culture, retain practically all the characteristics of 20th century culture and creative industry, have a very strong profit maximizing edge, and are not really interested in real innovation in terms of co-creation and capability building, especially from the point of view of the most socially deprived, the most marginalized, which is of course the big challenge that we face for the next few years in terms of really creating an enabling, inclusive knowledge society. So it's not a contraposition. We still need, of course, the patronage regime. Most cultural institutions still function to a large extent under the patronage regime, and we could ideally see the patronage regime as a sort of a research and development lab for cultural innovation, because in the end the purpose of patronage is putting the artist in the condition to experiment without further preoccupation from the point of view of their financial sustainability or immediately capturing the consents of a mass audience. So this is really very important still for culture and creative innovation. And of course we still need cultural and creative industries, because of course mass markets for cultural and creative content are extremely important, and they will remain such in the future. The point is that we do not have to consider these regimes as alternatives or as competing poles, but rather than different components of a very complex system that we need to manage to integrate.
Well, that was really rather interesting. I've got to say that these three regimes are clearly bumping into each other, and that presumably means that there are different regulations, incentives. It means that the politics is different because there'll be interests which will support one area, others will support something else. And that obviously affects ultimately the public administration. Do you think that's true?
It's absolutely true. And I think that today, for example, from the public administration point of view, there has been a focus on certain aspects. Think, for example, of the protection of intellectual property that are clearly important, but not as fundamental as it's commonly thought. So, for example, it's clear that intellectual property is extremely important for the profitability of cultural and creative industries. But at the same time, a too strict enforcement of intellectual property is very detrimental towards processes of co-creation. So again, we have to clarify what are the spheres we are interested to regulate and to what purpose. But I would also say that one of the most intriguing implications of this process of increasing confusion between content producers and users that is witnessed in the third regime is something that could interest, for example, public administrations directly, to think of public administration themselves as cultural producers and not simply as subjects who communicate, for example, through culture, processes that are mostly, of course, administered through completely different channels and leveraging on different factors. What I'm saying is that generally when we think of bureaucracy, we think not only of the opposite of creativity, but as the opposite of expression, as something that is really, let's say, the Weberian world of disenchanted rationality, where the only thing that you have to do is just to exercise your instrumental rationality to obtain some clear-cut results. But the truth is very different. And especially today, where the governance challenges that we are facing are so subtle and multifaceted, it's extremely important that, for example, public administration itself develops a creative edge, not simply in terms of doing fancy things, but really in terms of thinking of itself as a cultural producer that generates meaning in ways that go very much beyond the traditional paradigm of instrumental rationality and bring back issues like, for example, imagination, even pleasure, even cultural expression as something that, let's say, defines new spheres of meaning for the society.
I love that idea that you're talking about of this expressive bureaucrat who is playful and shows emotion and, of course, passion, because, of course, they are an actor as well, and I like that a lot. I'm just thinking for a moment about sort of other cultural institutions which we think are sort of very much part of the patronage regime, you know, museums, galleries, heritage entities. But clearly they have to rethink too, presumably, this is my question, about what they do, because perhaps business as usual won't work. And I'm particularly thinking about, because they get so much public funding, that people might increasingly say, well, look, there's this looming economic crisis happening. It's on our doorstep. Why invest in culture? Why invest in you? So will they have to rethink and express themselves and engage differently?
Absolutely. With all the extremely important functions that have been performed by museums, for example, in the past few centuries, it's still true that under the patronage regime, in a nutshell, the museum is a sort of civic church. So the point is the task of the museum is really to elevate the audience by providing them with very high standards of cultural appreciation. But then the consequence can be, as we recently saw, for example, with this small incident that got the global media though, this young student in Paris that was denied entrance to the Musée d'Orsay because her garments were too revealing, so to speak, something that, especially in a country like France, you would really hardly imagine, shows you how deeply ingrained still is this idea of the museum as the church. And the consequence is that if the museum presents itself as a cultural church, it's then clear that in the public opinion, one could say, but this is not the church I'm interested in. So if it is a problem of confessions, I have other inclinations, so why should I support this in particular? And this is a natural consequence of bringing the patronage logic to the extreme. So the kind of challenge that museums and more generally libraries, theaters face today is to shift their positioning from, let's say, the temple of knowledge to a new role that, again, is not denying the previous one, but is strongly complementing it in terms of a social hub that enables people to participate actively. If the museum presents itself as a church, people who feel they don't belong will not be interested in getting in. And especially if there are the incidents like the one that I briefly mentioned before, they are only reinforced in their conviction that they don't belong. This means that increasingly cultural institutions have to move beyond their own institutional space and go meet communities in the public space. So it's extremely important not simply reaching out to build a bigger or more faithful audience for the museum, but it's really starting a completely new kind of conversation where one of the purposes becomes being socially impactful from a viewpoint which is not the museum one, but the receiving end one, for example, in terms of the local community. So the real challenge that I see for cultural institutions in the close future is about social impact, but not as a necessity to become accountable and to please their own managing boards, but as a way to fully empower the potential mission of the museum of enabling the construction of the capabilities that really put everybody, even the most marginalized, in the conditions to participate actively. It's undeniable that in this moment, in the museum and more generally in the cultural institutions community, there is a clash of visions from this point of view between those who basically defend the business as usual and an increasing large part of museum practitioners and professionals and also high-profile managers that are pushing for this broadening of the vision and of the mission of the museum. And I personally think that if the point is getting a full support from public opinion and taxpayers, this new function of social and knowledge enabling is a necessity for the museum. But not simply again for, just to conclude, not simply again for instrumental reasons, but because this brings about an essential positive change in the capacity of the museum of creating new possibilities.
No, I love that. I mean, but basically what you're also saying, we're using the word culture now in a bigger sense, the culture of museums and these institutions basically have to change themselves. Yes. That reminds me then perhaps of another question then perhaps is, do you think therefore we need to reframe the cultural argument to ensure that it is relevant, and obviously you need to give evidence of its power and all of these things, and you know the common idea or the increasingly common idea of culture is the fourth pillar of sustainability beyond, you know, environmental, economic and social. Do you think that's got enough of a compelling resonance or drive within it, or would you suggest we go about it differently?
Well, the idea that culture is the fourth pillar of sustainability, I think, is absolutely well grounded in principle. But the point is that it should not be a petition of principle. We simply cannot take it for granted that it's self evident. This means that we have to venture into impact measurement with a different philosophy. So far, impact measurement has been a sort of sad necessity for cultural institutions to become accountable with a sense of, let's say, violation of the culture code. Because for the average cultural player, the idea that culture is beneficial to humans is something that should not be the subject of any argument. It's simply something that it's taken for granted. But what we are learning now is that not only, as we already knew, people is able to move emotionally and cognitively people in very powerful ways, but we are increasingly able to assess exactly in what sense and to what extent this happens. And at the same time, of course, we are also aware of the limitations of this. It does not happen every time and everywhere in all conditions. For artists and cultural professionals, realizing this can be extremely stimulating because it's a way to explore new poetical possibilities. So what I'm really convinced about is that embracing the new area of impact evaluation of culture is not simply something that is useful to build more consensus around culture, but is something that is expanding the canvas of cultural action and creativity in a dramatically interesting way.
Now that feels rather liberating and flourishing. These are all these words. I feel I need to open out myself. Well, look, my last question, Pier Luigi, is really, can you just give us some snippets of sort of catalytic moves that governments or local authorities could undertake so that culture, the creative economy and all of that sphere flourishes, to use the word again, but also gives back to society?
Yes, I think that when people enter a creative mode, not in the cheesy way, but really being cognitive and emotionally stimulated to focus on something meaningful for them, they have exceptional capacity to contribute to collective problem solving. So what I really think would be interesting for public administrations is to think in terms of cultural problem solving. How can we harness the creativity of people in participating in problem solving for issues that are, of course, of burning relevance, like, for example, intercultural dialogue or refurbishment of rundown parts of the city or improvement of the functioning of public utilities. You simply name it, or improving transport systems. I think that from this point of view, there is a really, really huge opportunity to leverage upon cultural problem solving, but this goes much beyond simply opening public consultations and asking people to give their opinion. Sometimes this is even backfiring, because if people are simply asked an opinion without being actively engaged, they often unconsciously feel frustrated, and protest clearly prevails over proposal. So what we need is exactly the contrary, enabling people to participate in collective problem solving in ways that, of course, are bringing everybody out of the comfort zone, both the citizens and also public administration itself, or cultural players that are called upon to facilitate or even to accelerate these processes. So what I really see as an exciting possibility for the future is some pilot experimentation on collective problem solving from the cultural point of view. So we could call it cultural problem solving as a new experimental line of administrative governance for our complex societies in the next 10 years.
I like that phrase, cultural problem solving, and that notion of the cultural lens, which actually, as you're saying, is so powerful and rich, which we obviously often push back into some sort of corner. So it's really about putting the cultural thinking at centre stage. And it involves also, obviously, having cultural literacy. Pier Luigi, that was great. I love hearing your languid, lovely, sweeping voice that makes these lovely, beautiful arguments. So I hope soon we will be able to actually show some passion with each other and have a good glass of wine. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. It's been really, really fun in the constructive and positive to share ideas with you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.